I'm back with Sermon 8 of Crash and Burn, and I'm just finishing up. Now, we've just heard a song on Sermon 7 of Amazing Grace. Now, not too many people may know this, or many people may know this. John Newton was a slave owner, a captain of a slave ship, and realised one day that slavery is wrong. And as a conversion, so to speak, he pens the lyrics to the existing melody. As an act of redemption, we all seem to need that once in a while. Amazing Grace is also an unofficial national anthem of the Cherokee Nation during the forced repatriation from their ancestral lands of Oklahoma by the US government. Thousands of Native people were forcibly marched 2,000 miles, and over 4,000 died along the way. This became known as the Trail of Tears, and they were not allowed to stop or attend the dead, so instead known as the Trail of Tears. They were not allowed to stop and attend to the dead, so instead they would quietly sing Amazing Grace as a way to honour the passing. It has been translated in many native languages, including Native and Sign Language. It is really beautiful to watch. This man called John Newton, he basically, in 1750, he married Catholic, with whom he had been in love with many years. By 1755, after a serious illness, he had given by seafaring forever. During his days as a sailor, he had begun his educating himself, teaching himself Latin among the subjects. From 1755 to 1760, Newton was a surveyor of tides at Liverpool, where he came to know George Whitefield, a deacon in the Church of England. See, he came to know this deacon in the church. And in a sense, that's probably where this amazing grace comes from. The grace of God, through the grace of God, he met this deacon called George Whitefield from the Church of England, evangelistic preacher and leader of the Calvinistic Methodist Church. Newton became Whitefield's enthusiastic disciple. During this period, Newton also met and came the admirer of John Wesley, founder of the Methodism. Newton's self-education continued and learned Greek and Hebrew. He decided to become a minister and applied the Archbishop of York ordination. The Archbishop refused his request, but Newton persisted in his goal and was subsequently ordained by the Bishop of Lincoln, accepted the currency of Onley, Buckinghamshire. Newton's church became so crowded during the service that he had to be enlarged. He preached not only in the Onley but in other parts of the country. In 1767, the poet William Cowper settled at Onley, and he had Newton become friends. See, it's called persistence. You wouldn't think that a person that obviously was not a Christian, didn't even follow. He followed the world, and he followed in what the world was doing. He was crashing and burning. He was flatlining. He was doing things that he knew really deep down in his heart. But it's through the amazing grace and the grace of God that eventually, what happened? He became a preacher. He became a pastor. And through that, he created this song, Amazing Grace. He wrote this song. See, John Newton, right, finally he owned his request to exchange in the service, Leon. He became the servant of a slave trader and was brutally abused. In early 1748, he was rescued by a sea captain who had known as John's father, John Newton, ultimately became the captain of his own ship, which supplied the slave trade. Although he had some early religious instructions from his mother, who had died when he was a child. He had long since given up any religious convictions. However, on a homeward voyage, while he was attempting to steer his ship through a violent storm, he experienced what he was to refer to later as the Great Deliverance. So God's grace and God's deliverance can come in many forms and many ways. So in that sense, God can deliver his grace and his deliverance in many ways. And this is where we're talking about the words crash and burn. When you feel alone and your loyal friends are hard to find, you're caught in a one-way street, or you're caught in a storm, or you're caught in this ferocious storm, with monsters in your head, when hopes and dreams are far away and you feel like you can't face the day. I am sure that John Newton couldn't face that day. He'd given up long ago on religious convictions. But then one day, however, homeward voyage, while he was attempting to steer his ship through a violent storm, he experienced what was to refer as a great deliverance. So sometimes in the storm, sometimes in the commotion, God's grace can come upon you, and then you realise that you know where your calling is, and you know that you need to be giving your life to Jesus Christ. And that's a personal decision. That's a decision that you make. He recorded in his journals that when all seemed lost and the ship would surely sink, he acclaimed, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Later in his cabin he reflected on what he had said and began to believe that God had addressed him through the storm, and the grace had begun to work for him. For the rest of his life he observed the anniversary May the 10th, 1748 as a day of conversion, a day of humiliation in which he subjected his will to a higher power. He subjected his will to Jesus Christ. That was the higher power that he was talking about. Through many dangers and toils and snares I have already come, since the grace brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. He continued in the slave trade for a time after his conversion, but however he saw to it that his slaves under his care were treated humanely. See, basically, it was through the grace of God that John Newton became a preacher and gave his life to Jesus. And it's a bit strange. You might be in this church tonight and you might see that you're going through a violent storm, not like John Newton, but you're sitting in church and you feel like you're going through a violent storm, and you feel like it's time now, it's time of deliverance. Jesus is talking to you, God is talking to you, and he's saying, it's time. But do we listen? It depends on where your heart is and where you're devoting your heart. When I'm looking at all this, it's so amazing to see that out of a person that had some early religious instructions from his mother, and he'd given up religious conviction, and he just continued, and he was a slave. He was brutally abused. He became a servant. He was a servant on a slave trader's ship, and eventually captained his own ship and supplied slave to the slave trade. But eventually there was a conviction there, and then eventually Jesus won over, and the grace of God won. See, goodness will always win out of bad. Always goodness and love, the love of God and the grace of God and the righteousness of God, and through the blood of Jesus Christ, it will always conquer over darkness and bad and things that are not good. So basically, just to share you with that John Newton was a servant on a slave ship, and eventually he was rescued by a sea captain, which is known to be John's father now, and then ultimately he became a captain of his own ship. So sometimes we can feel, as we look at crash and burn, that we're crashing and we're burning. Obviously he must have felt, John Newton must have felt that he was crashing and burning. And he must have felt all alone. And he was like he was caught in a one-way street with monsters in his head. And he couldn't feel to face another day.